Hello, horror stories. My name is Daniel, and I have decided to tell you about a paranormal experience that happened to me a few years ago when my mother passed away and I attended her funeral. The truth is that it had been a long time since I had a close relationship with her. When our father died, everything changed: her character, her treatment towards us. She became a completely different person and very difficult to deal with. But that was not the main reason why I decided to distance myself from her. A few years ago, she started to isolate herself and to relate to very strange people. Her character and the way she spoke changed drastically. At first, I didn't understand what was wrong with her, but then I realized how macabre these people she spent most of her time with were. They would do satanic rituals at night and all kinds of strange things in my living room. My mother became increasingly cold and distant. At that time, in the house where we lived, very strange things started to happen. You could feel a presence wandering around the house at night. You could hear whispers coming from shadows that kept wandering around, and the energy became very dark. I was literally terrified. Eventually, I decided to leave. I couldn't live another minute in such fear, and my mother had become a complete stranger. When she passed away, my sister called me to tell me the news. She told me that the body was already at the funeral home, and that we had to go there to process all the paperwork. However, she was on the other side of the country and would not arrive that same day. I was taken by surprise by the news. I felt a very strange sensation when I hung up the phone. Still, it was my mother. I grabbed my car keys and left immediately for the funeral home. The atmosphere was already depressing and gloomy. Upon arrival, I was informed that she had been dead for a day when she was found. A neighbor, upon visiting her, found her passed out in her bed, and forensics determined that the cause of death was a heart attack. I began to fill out all the necessary paperwork to be able to watch over her. I remember that there was no one but me at the reception desk signing documents when, suddenly, I heard my mother's voice calling my name. I went blank for a few seconds, thinking that maybe it was a figment of my imagination. But within a few seconds I heard again, "Daniel, come with me." I got up from my chair in a start and started walking toward the living room where my mother was without thinking. I walked down a dimly lit hallway, narrow and flanked by rooms on either side, some with coffins that could be seen through the half-open doors. I don't know how I had the courage to continue, but I needed to confirm that it was my mother's voice, even though she was lying in a coffin. I walked the length of the hallway until I reached the last door, which was right in front of me. I opened the door slowly, looking for the light knob without success, as it was completely dark. Then I took out my cell phone and turned on the flashlight. There was my mother, her body on a stretcher, her eyes open and her skin extremely white. I was very shocked to see her. I had never seen anyone's lifeless body, let alone my mother's. To be honest, I was terrified. Honestly, I felt terror. I turned with the light of my cell phone trying to find the switch, and at that moment I heard the wheels of the stretcher where my mother was lying turn. I quickly turned the flashlight towards her and saw her sitting up, watching me from the stretcher. I was shocked. My legs were unresponsive from the terror I felt. Finally, I turned and, shining the flashlight on her, started running to get out of there. I arrived at the reception with my heart beating a mile a minute, out of breath and with an indescribable feeling of panic. As I was crying non-stop, I bumped into the girl at the front desk. She asked me if everything was okay, but I couldn't articulate a word. She brought me a glass of water and helped me sit up. I caught my breath, but I didn't want to tell her anything. I didn't want him to get a shock. Besides, he wouldn't believe me and would think I was in a state of insanity. I just told her that I was upset about what had happened with my mother, that I had finished filling out all the paperwork and that I had to leave. I arrived home in complete shock. My wife was waiting for me with a cup of tea, but I didn't want to tell her anything, much less my children. I didn't want to alarm them. And besides, it was hard to believe. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of my mother sitting on the gurney, already dead, watching me, and my walking down that dark hallway listening to her voice calling me, kept haunting my head. The next morning, without having been able to sleep a wink, we went to the wake. Everything was ready for the ceremony to begin. It was 8 o'clock in the morning and neither the friends nor the rest of the relatives had arrived yet. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 9, so I went early to pay for the wake. Meanwhile, my 6-year-old daughter Marylin was waiting in the living room where her grandmother's drawer was, with a drawing she had made for her and her favorite teddy bear. Seeing through the window that my oldest son Brian was outside talking on his cell phone, I immediately went to where my little girl was. When I walked in, I saw Marylin leaning on Grandma's drawer, talking and laughing. I immediately said to her, "Marylin, come over here. What are you doing?" She looked at me angrily and replied, "Grandma wants me to stay with her, we're just talking." I quickly walked over to my mother's drawer, and now she was with her eyes closed. I stood there for a few seconds watching her as I tried to take in what Marylin had just said. I took her by the hand and led her towards the door as she struggled, telling me that she wanted to stay with her grandmother, that she didn't want to leave. I became furious, and without thinking I said, "Marylin, stop talking nonsense. She's dead." She looked at me and began to cry, ran out of the room in search of her mother, my wife, carried her in her arms, and asked her what was wrong. Marylin replied the same thing, that her grandmother didn't want her to go, and that I was bad for not letting her stay. My wife looked at me and tried to reassure her, taking her to a candy machine in another room. My son was still outside talking on the phone. I went into the room and began to pray, seeking peace for my mother, wishing she wasn't a soul in pain as I feared she was. As I prayed, I felt a gust of wind blow out the candles around the coffin, which I thought was very strange since the room had no windows and the door was closed. It was impossible for there to be a draft. In a few seconds, the lights began to flicker until they were completely extinguished. I reached into my pockets for my cell phone, but remembered that my oldest son had it and would be outside talking to his girlfriend. At that instant, a shiver ran through my body. I turned quickly to leave the room, but when I tried to open the door, I discovered that it was locked. I used all my strength to open it and pounded desperately for someone to hear me. But few funeral home staff were working at that time of the morning. I started to panic and suddenly felt something tap me on my shoulder. I turned sharply, and there she was, my mother's soul, standing there watching me. She told me she was coming back for her, for my daughter who no longer belonged to me. Her macabre expression and dark eyes were barely visible in the darkness, with her pale face, and I felt her breathing so close to me. From that moment on, I don't remember anything else. I felt a strong pain in my chest and lost consciousness. I woke up in the hospital, next to my wife and a doctor. I was startled out of bed as I remembered what my mother had told me. Without saying a word, I sat up and removed all the wires that had been put in me. The doctor and my wife were desperately trying to calm me down, telling me that I should stay at rest, that I had had a pre-infarction and had been found on the floor of the wake room, and that I could not go home yet. I asked my wife where Marylin was. She told me that she had been at the wake with her older brother and aunt, and that they decided not to bring her to the hospital so as not to worry her any more about my pre-infarction, but that they would be coming home soon. I ran out to the truck, and as soon as my wife got in, I started. On the way, I told her everything that had happened. Her expression changed from concern to terror as we drove along. When we got to the funeral home, we ran downstairs in search of Marylin. We ran in screaming her name, but the first thing I saw was my son. I asked him where his sister was, and he told me she was in the bathroom, asking me what the urgency was. Without delay, we ran to the bathrooms, but she was not there. I went out in search of her, going through every room in the place. Everyone in the room started calling for her. I asked the staff for help, and we searched every nook and cranny, but Marylin was unresponsive. Panic began to take hold of me, but I realized that there was one more place to look for her, in my mother's coffin. I slowly walked into the room and noticed that the coffin was closed. I tried to open it, but it was sealed. I ran to ask the staff if the wake was with the casket closed, and they replied in surprise that it was not. I explained the situation and begged them to open it, as I did not understand how it could be hermetically sealed if no one had sealed it. We tried several times until we finally managed to open it, and there was Marylin, next to my mother's body. I couldn't believe my eyes. I quickly took her out of there, trying to wake her up, but she didn't respond. My wife, seeing her in there, and then seeing her unresponsive, panicked in desperate screams. called the ambulance, and just before they arrived, Marylin opened her eyes when she heard my screams. She was fine, but when she saw us, she began to cry. We immediately took her out of the room and asked her how she had gotten there. Marylin told us that Grandma asked her not to leave her alone, to lie down with her for a while, and she had fallen asleep. We couldn't believe it. We left there, immediately, with a sense of dread that I can hardly explain. I had never had such a supernatural experience before. It seemed as if my mother's demonic soul had tried to take my daughter to the afterlife. I can't find an explanation for what happened, and I don't think I ever will. If you have enjoyed this story, we invite you to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any others. Until next time.